Hello, everybody. Whenever you might be watching this, hopefully you're having a lovely day. My name is Professor Ferrero, and we're jumping back into U.S. history 1877 to the present. Today, we are going to be covering the Great War once again, but we're going to be covering the home front this time. Last class, we talked about the war itself, how the U.S. got involved in this European war, how we eventually got dragged in, and the aftermath. But today we're taking a little bit of a step back and we're going to be looking at how World War I affected the average everyday American. So, with that, we're going to go ahead and get started on that. And we're going to start off with some nice propaganda. Even Dog can enlist. Why not you? You're going to see a lot of this in World War I and World War II. A lot of advertisements, a lot of propaganda trying to get the American people to do specific things. So, the war and the state. Many progressives are going to view this as the opportunity to push forward their values globally. That's really what Woodrow Wilson is going to do with his 14 points. During the war, the federal government is going to seize unprecedented levels of power and grow drastically. I would argue that really 3 presidents in the 20th century are going to grow the size of the federal government more than any others, and Woodrow Wilson's going to be the first of the 3. During the war, they're going to form the Selective Services Act, the War Boards Industry, the War Labor Board, and they're going to take control of a lot of industries. They're going to push a lot of consumer companies to produce goods for the war. You're going to see companies like Ford producing military vehicles. Ultimately, the federal government's also going to push forward wartime propaganda to spur on support for the war, and they create the Committee of Public Information, which the longer you think about it, the scarier it is, because it's meant to shape the views of the public. They're trying to get the American public to have a specific opinion, and they're forming government agencies to do that. They're also going to encourage the public to buy war bonds. Bonds are a little bit different than the type of bond you might be thinking of if you're thinking of jail bond. A bond basically is a mini loan that you give to the government. Basically, you give them X amount of money and they promise 5, 10, maybe 15 years later, they're going to give you Y amount back. Maybe they give you 10% more than you put in. That's how a war bond works. That's how a normal bond works. A war bond is going to be to fund the war effort, where a normal bond would go to just funding the government more generally. So the federal government is going to be very, very involved in the home front, very, very involved in the lives of Americans in World War I. So with all of that being said, we got some propaganda. I want you for the U.S. Army. I really do love a lot of the World War I propaganda. It's very to the point. It tries to gets you to feel a level of patriotism, a desire to serve your country. And here we have another piece of propaganda. Fight, and if you can't fight, what's your other option? Buy war bonds. Maybe you're crippled. Maybe you're a woman who can't serve in an active military role. Maybe you're too old. Maybe you're too young. But there is something that you can at least do. If you can't serve in the military, you can buy a war bond. So, the war effort at home. Americans are going to be encouraged to help at the war effort because all of the white men are off fighting in the war. It's ultimately going to fall on women and African Americans to fill the factory jobs left behind. About 370,000 African Americans are also going to go fight in the war, hoping to better their lot in life. Ultimately, a lot of civil rights tends to take place after major wars. So it's understandable why they do it. World War I actually tends to be the outlier where not a lot of progress is made, but they do go ahead and do that. They do serve the United States. Ultimately, they're going to be encouraged, the American people, to buy bonds to help fund the war. They're also going to be encouraged to grow victory gardens and ration. Growing victory gardens is growing vegetables for you and your family to eat. The mindset behind it is, if I can grow vegetables for me and for my family, I don't have to buy them from the store. And if I don't have to buy them from the store, Guess who they can go feed? They can go feed the soldiers over in Europe on the front lines. Same thing with rations. If I eat less bread or I drink less coffee, that can go to soldiers over in Europe. Ultimately, children are going to be taught lessons in patriotism and about the war. And ultimately, men are going to be encouraged to enlist. A draft is even instituted during World War I. So, you got a advertisement here for a victory garden. If you see every garden a munitions plant, it's invoking this idea that you're contributing to the war effort. Just like a munitions plant would supply bullets to a soldier, growing a victory garden is going to supply food for a soldier. I do really love this next one just because of how catchy it is. This one is encouraging people to ration. Save the wheat, help the fleet. Eat less bread. Very simple, very to the point. Every American has a role to play in this war. World War I is very much a total war. That's a term that you may have heard if you've ever taken a world history class or a U.S. history class. A total war is when every part of the society, not just the military, is mobilizing towards the war effort. One of the earliest examples we see of this really in world history is going to be the Mongols. The Mongols, every part of the society is feeding into the Mongol war effort. And we're going to see that in both world wars here in the United States as well, that you are going to see the entire country mobilized towards the war effort. So, freedom is going to be limited during World War I. You have the Espionage Act of 1917. Basically, this is going to prohibit not just spying on the army, but interfering with your draft. And this is the really scary part. Also, any false statements that might hinder military success. Who defines false statements? The government. Basically, if anything you say, maybe I go ahead and say, hey, it's not really worth the U.S. going to war with Germany, and I managed to convince several people not to join the military, that could fall under a false statement, and I could go to jail for that. Similarly, the Sedition Act does basically the exact same thing, except takes it a step further. It says you can't just not talk smack about the military, you can't talk smack about the government. You cannot publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings pertaining to the government. And again, who defines what this is? It's the government who ultimately defines this. Both laws are really meant to target European immigrants who may have been critical of the war, in particular German Americans. Eugene V. Debs, you might remember him from way, way back during the Pullman strike. Eugene V. Debs is going to be arrested again in 1918 under the Espionage Act. Ultimately, when he runs for president in 1920, he is going to run from prison. And he actually does get several thousand votes. Here we have a good political cartoon being critical of the sedition bills, the Espionage and Sedition Acts. If you look, it's a giant snake about to gobble up honest opinion, free speech, and freedom of the press. They are represented by little kids, and they literally have no way of defending themselves against the sedition bills, because sedition bills are a very, very clear violation of Americans' First Amendment rights. You also have overall a rise of anti-immigrant sentiment. In particular, it's geared towards Germans. You have the rise of eugenics that continues to be a major thing, kind of the selective breeding of human beings, as well as the rise of the pseudoscience of physiognomy. Physiognomy is the belief that certain, usually characteristics of the head or the face, would indicate specific things about an individual. So it might be something like if you have a dent in your head at a certain part, you're less prone to making moral decisions. That type of thing. It's a very, very fake pseudoscience that was really just a excuse for scientific, and I'm putting air quotes around that, racism. You also have an anti-German crusade. German Americans are going to be targeted for racial violence during this war. There's going to be stories of dachshunds and other German dogs being stoned to death in certain streets as an anti-German protest. You're also going to have in other cities around the country, they will rip out German songs from the hymnals and the school music catalogs. There are Stein breaking. Those are the German beer mugs breaking. I don't even know what to call it. Festivals, I guess. They're breaking these things for fun. It's a targeted attack against German culture. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to post a link down in the description. It's a really, really good video talking about how they target German Americans. Ultimately, they're actually going to put German Americans in detention camps. We always talk about the detention camps of the Japanese during World War II, but a lot of people don't know that German Americans, some of which families had been here since before the American Revolution, were thrown in these detention camps because they might be enemies of the state. You also see a furthering of immigration restrictions. By 1916, you're starting to see IQ tests for immigrants. And in 1917, they're going to put forward an English literacy test, basically cracking down on virtually all countries except English-speaking ones. Asians in particular, they're still being targeted, and functionally by the 1920s, the only Asians being allowed in are going to be Filipinos, and that's because the Philippines is a colony of the United States, like we talked about in the American Empire lecture a couple of lectures back. And the amount of Filipinos let in each year is under 100. So unless if you're a Western European, during World War I, it's going to get progressively harder for you to get into the country. So, how are African Americans treated during World War I? Many see this as an opportunity to make real progress. That had happened in the past. The War of 1812 was a great example of that. The Civil War was another great example of that. Wars after this, such as World War II and the Korean War, offer a lot of opportunities for African Americans to advance their civil rights. However, World War I, for one reason or another, is really the odd war out here. It doesn't really provide much true freedom. While they get factory jobs whenever the white men come back from the war, they just go ahead and replace them there. Because of all of the discrimination facing African Americans in the South, they're going to start leaving. We talked about it a couple of lectures ago with the Closeout of the West. I believe that was lecture 5.2, where we talked about the exodusters. That's still going on, except they're not just moving out west, they're moving to the north. They're also moving to major cities. This is known as the Great Migration. Racial and domestic violence is not going to just remain during the South during this time either. Dozens of African Americans are going to be killed in St. Louis, Illinois in 1917 in a race riot. Ultimately, again, all of the progress that had been made during the war in terms of black jobs, it gets given back to the white soldiers whenever they come back. And President Woodrow Wilson is going to play The Birth of a Nation, a KKK propaganda film, on the White House lawn. This is going to be a part of a larger resurgence by the KKK, which had functionally died out in the late 1800s. It's going to come back with a vengeance. You are going to see the KKK march through the streets of Washington, D.C. in 1923 with hoods up. That's how confident and bold they get during this time period. There's a revival of racism with the KKK. Here you can see the poster of The Birth of a Nation. Woodrow Wilson showed this movie right here over on the White House lawn. This is what he decided to show as a movie on the White House lawn. It says the fiery cross of the Ku Klux Klan. Very much ties up the idea of America with the KKK itself. Ultimately, all of this hatred towards African Americans is going to lead to one of the worst things in American history, the Tulsa riot, aka Black Wall Street. It's a race riot that's going to take place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. It's the worst race riot in American history. It's going to happen because a group of black veterans are going to stop a lynching from happening. Because of this, white racists, white terrorists are going to kill over 300 African Americans in a riot, and ultimately over 10,000 of them are going to lose their homes due to fires set by white hate mobs. It is one of the most horrifying things that we have done in American history, and it deserves to be remembered. We need to remember where we came from to understand how we need to be better and to not forget where we came from and what we're capable of going back to. You can see the numbers here with the Great Migration. If you notice, all of these places that they're moving are major cities. You see massive increases in a lot of major cities in the black population. Cleveland in particular, there's over a 300% increase of the African American population. Ultimately, most of them are going to be moving to northern cities. However, unfortunately, this map doesn't really show it. A lot of African Americans are also going to move to major cities in the South, such as New Orleans, Atlanta, and even Houston. Here in Houston, we have historically black neighborhoods, such as 3rd and 5th Ward, that are really going to be established during this time. African Americans aren't going to be the only ones of the target of racial discrimination, though. Remember, during World War I, Vladimir Lenin goes into Russia and starts a communist revolution. Because of that, everybody is afraid that a communist revolution might happen in their home country next. This is going to lead to the first Red Scare during 1919 to 1920. Eastern and Southern European immigrants would be the prime suspects of a potential communist revolution. Ultimately, the labor movements are going to get caught up in a lot of this communist talk and a lot of this communist lingo. J. Edgar Hoover. This is the same guy who, if you watch the video on German persecution, is the one who threw German Americans in detention camps. He's going to later create the FBI, and he starts the Palmer raids. The Palmer raids are where over 5,000 people are arrested, mostly targeting labor organizers. Hundreds of quote-unquote radical immigrants are going to be deported. These are alleged communists. There are stories of Italian Americans getting the electric chair for being associated with the communist movement. Now, were some of these immigrants communist? Undoubtedly. But most of them aren't going to be. It's going to be xenophobia that's really fueling all of this hatred and suspicion of Southern and Eastern European Americans. Ultimately, American patriotism is going to start being tied to the political and economic status quo. If you look over on the right with the picture, you can see a European anarchist about to stab Lady Liberty in the back. There's huge suspicion towards these people, and so there's a backlash. There's a push towards going towards the status quo. Ultimately, after 20 years of craziness, because remember, during all of this, the progressive era is still going on. The progressive era is a lot of change. On top of this, we just got through a world war. Everybody is tired. Everybody is done. They want things to just go back to the way they once were. They want things to go back to normal. That's going to bring us into the 1920s in the Return to Normalcy movement by Warren G. Harding. It's going to close out the progressive era. It's going to close out World War I, and we are going to be heading into the Roaring 20s next. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. Professor Ferrero, out.